All right, welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. This week, we're going to be taking a close look at what EU versus disinfo has been highlighting over the past week from, let's see, March 31st to April 6th, 2025.
Okay.
So there's a couple things I thought we'd focus on this week. First, there's a really interesting disinformation review article talking about the Kremlin and their kind of shifting narratives around the idea of elections in Ukraine.
Okay.
And then there was also kind of separately a piece on the disinformation landscape surrounding what's happening in Georgia right now.
Right.
And it's kind of interesting, even at this high level, you start to see how some of the playbooks that the Kremlin uses are kind of similar across these different geopolitical situations.
Sure.
So I thought, why don't we kind of deep dive into both of these topics?
Yeah, sounds good.
And try to identify the core strategies and narratives that they're using. And then hopefully by the end of it, you'll have a better understanding of the disinformation dynamics that we're seeing at play.
Yeah, I think it's really telling how two completely different, situations, different geographies, different histories, different political contexts, but they're both subject to remarkably similar disinformation tactics.
Right.
And I think that speaks to this, very centralized and adaptable approach that the Kremlin takes. So yeah, why don't we start with Georgia? And just to set the stage, we have the Georgian Dream Party who decided to put on hold the EU accession talks until 2028.
Right.
A decision that has been fueling protests since the October 2024 elections, where there were allegations of electoral fraud, police crackdowns, the whole thing.
Right. And then, of course, we've seen the pro-Kremlin outlets, inside Georgia really jump on this and try to, kind of discredit the pro-European protesters, downplay any of the police violence that happened, and really just frame the Western allies as the ones who were instigating all this.
Exactly.
And then, of course, the push for closer ties with Russia. I think it's very predictable in a lot of ways.
It is predictable, and I think what's particularly, striking is how seamlessly the narratives that are being pushed by these pro-Kremlin outlets align with the messaging coming from the Georgian Dream Party itself.
Yeah.
So you have this very close echo, which suggests that there is a very specific, coordination in shaping the dominant information space.
Right.
And a key element of that is the use of derogatory labels.
Right.
We're seeing very specific terms that are being used against anyone who opposes, this trajectory. We're seeing terms like liberal fascists,
Right.
traitors, the ever-present puppets of the West being thrown around very liberally. And the core argument is that these groups are trying to violently overthrow the constitutional order.
Right. And then it even extends beyond that, right? I mean, they're specifically targeting, President Zurabishvili.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
And she's being portrayed as kind of an agent of the West, working for foreign intelligence.
Right.
And that plays into this fifth column narrative that we've seen, time and time again. And all the while, the police are being, framed as the heroes, the ones that are defending Georgia from this coup.
Right. And some of the claims that they're making are really, remarkable. So, for example, there was this accusation, completely unfounded, that President Zurabishvili called for sacrificing children.
Oh, wow.
In order to, rile up the protesters.
Wow.
And it's a claim that is designed to, shock and demonize. And then there was this completely fabricated story about the McCain Institute calling for a sacral sacrifice.
Wow.
So, just blatantly false narratives meant to outrage people. But, it all contributes to this environment of distrust and animosity towards anyone who's pro-European.
Yeah. And it's not just individuals. I mean, you also have organizations like USI, the National Endowment for Democracy.
Right.
Different foundations, NGOs, even diplomatic missions, all being presented as puppet masters of the protests.
Yeah. The targeting of US side and EDD, I feel like, we see that so often.
Yeah.
And I think it really, it plays into this existing narrative or this existing, idea that people have about foreign influence, right?
Right.
So it's very easy to kind of, convince people that any kind of dissent is externally driven.
Yeah. And you have Russian state outlets like Sputnik really amplifying these narratives. So, for example, Sputnik had this cannon fodder narrative that they were
Like,
pushing,
oh, interesting.
claiming that, opposition leaders are intentionally staying behind the scenes and using young protesters as cannon fodder.
Wow.
Basically saying that they're using these kids as expendable resources.
So cynical.
Yeah, very cynical. And it's particularly ironic when you consider that there have been reports suggesting that the protesters themselves have been very intentionally distancing themselves from these established opposition leaders.
Right. Good.
Probably because those leaders have their own problems with maintaining public trust.
Sure.
So the Sputnik narrative is completely, the opposite of what's actually happening on the ground.
Right.
But while they're promoting this idea of cannon fodder, they're also very actively, minimizing or denying, any credible reports or evidence of police brutality.
Of course.
And instead, they're praising the police for being professional.
Right.
They're labeling the protesters as extremists and radicals, saying that they need to be forced into peace.
Right.
And a key part of this delegitimization effort is the framing of the situation as a Maidan scenario.
Right.
And just to clarify for listeners who might not be aware of the term Maidan scenario, it refers to the 2014 Ukrainian revolution.
Right.
But in the pro-Kremlin narrative, it's used as a derogatory term to describe any kind of popular protest against a government.
Right. As a way of framing it as some kind of like Western-backed coup.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's all about undermining the legitimacy of any kind of popular uprising.
Right. Right. And then, I mean, we see the classic color revolution narrative here as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's a central part of this whole thing.
Right.
By portraying these protests as yet another Western engineered regime change.
Right.
They're leveraging a trope that is very well established within the pro-Kremlin ecosystem.
Right.
So you have these accusations against the U.S. and the EU for inciting unrest and civil war.
Right.
And again, they're focusing specifically on USAID and ED. And then they even bring up Trump's suspension of foreign aid in the past.
Right.
As proof that there's this Western policy of undermining national sovereignty.
Right.
And then they go on to say that USAID is funding subversive activities and suppressing conservative voices.
Right.
Specifically mentioning Alt-Info, which is a far-right group in Georgia.
Right.
So again, it's completely distorting the actual situation and who the players are.
Right. And what their agendas are. And it's really, when you start to see the way that these narratives then line up with the official statements coming from the Georgian Dream Party.
Yeah.
About the protests being a coup, about the West blackmailing and interfering, it's like it's just a mirror,
Yeah,
right?
It's hard to ignore. And that mirroring strongly suggests that there is this deliberate and coordinated effort to shape public opinion. And then of course you see this classic disinformation tactic of blaming others for what you're doing yourself.
Right.
So for example, Sputnik, Georgia, they allege that Western intelligence is professionally organizing these protests.
Right.
Sputnik South Ossetia went even further and said that there's a U.S.-led Euromaidan scenario unfolding.
Right.
And then Sputnik, Georgia, predictably accuses the EU of interfering in Georgia's internal affairs.
Of course.
So it's this very clear pattern of projecting your own intentions and actions onto your opponents.
Right. Right. And then, of course, they try to tie it into what's happening in Ukraine as well.
Of course. Yeah.
Sputnik South Ossetia was floating the claim that President Zelensky wants regime change in Georgia so that he can recruit more fighters.
Right.
Which I guess that's the way that they're trying to weave this all into a larger narrative about Western aggression.
Yeah, it's all part of this larger narrative. And then you also have this besieged fortress mentality that's being promoted.
Right.
Sputnik, Georgia, had this whole Kursk 2 scenario.
Oh, wow.
Where they're basically saying that the West is trying to open up a second front against Russia in the Caucasus.
Okay.
And they say that this plan involves a coup in Georgia, provocations, foreign militants.
Right.
The whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
And it's a very classic fear-mongering tactic, right? To try to rally support by portraying this external threat.
Right. Right. And then, unsurprisingly, the pro-Kremlin media have been, very enthusiastic about Georgia Dream's decision to halt the EU accession talks.
Of course.
And they're framing this as Georgia standing up to the West.
Right.
Even as a liberation. They talk about Georgia being liberated from sodomite Europe, they call it.
Right.
And achieving real sovereignty by doing this.
Right.
And then the Russian outlets praise the government for preventing a color revolution.
Exactly. Yeah. And so all of this, rejection of the West is coupled with this promotion of closer ties to Russia.
Right.
They're calling for Georgia to join the 3+3 platform, BRICS, the Eurasian Economic Union.
Right.
And of course, the big contradiction here is that they're portraying Russia as the guarantor of Georgia's territorial integrity.
Right.
Despite the fact that Russia occupies Abkhazia and South Ossetia.
Right, right.
So it's just a very, blatant example of how disinformation can disregard reality.
Totally.
And then they even try to bring the breakaway regions into all of this.
Oh, wow.
So there are claims that Washington and Brussels are pressuring Abkhazia and South Ossetia.
Okay.
Sputnik Abkhazia even mentioned these, pre-election reconciliation statements that came from Tbilisi.
Okay.
While Sputnik South Ossetia was demanding apologies and legal commitments from Georgia.
Right.
So again, they're trying to position Russia as this impartial mediator.
Right.
And then finally, we see the use of this enemies everywhere narrative.
Right.
Sputnik Georgia alleged that Armenian political figures and NGOs were participating in the protests.
Okay.
They claimed that there were 2,000 professional Maidenists present.
Wow.
And they even said that Russian citizens in Georgia were being pressured or evicted for not supporting the protests.
Right.
So it's just this multi-pronged effort to create suspicion and division.
Right. Yeah. So basically, they're throwing everything at the wall, hoping something sticks.
Exactly. Yeah. They're trying to create this sense of chaos and instability.
Right. Right. Okay. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about Ukraine. So the Disinformation Review article that I mentioned, it highlights this shift in how the Kremlin is talking about elections in Ukraine.
Right.
And I think that's really interesting because it seems like kind of a new development.
It is, yeah. It's quite noteworthy considering their previous stance.
Right, right. So, I mean, previously the Kremlin was very much focused on the idea that the Ukrainian government was illegitimate.
Exactly.
That they were the ones who were preventing any kind of peace, from happening, and that the only way forward was to have elections to get rid of Zelensky.
Right.
And they wouldn't even negotiate directly with Zelensky, right? And their whole message was that Russia was the one who was really defending democracy.
Right.
And the rule of law in Ukraine.
Yeah, they were trying to position themselves as the saviors of Ukraine.
Right,
yeah.
Right. But then, things got a little complicated when it looked like Ukraine might actually be preparing for elections, even though there's, a war going on.
Yeah, it seems like that potential development caught the Kremlin off guard.
Right. And then, I mean, what's so interesting is how quickly they then tried to downplay the elections.
Right.
As if they weren't, so important anymore.
Yeah. It was a very obvious attempt to kind of backtrack and reconcile these two contradictory positions.
Right.
Yeah.
So now they're saying, elections are still important for peace talks, but then at the same time, they're also pushing these narratives about how, there's going to be fraud, there's going to be a lack of transparency.
Exactly. Yeah. And then, predictably, they're accusing Brussels of obstructing the elections.
Right, of course.
Which is, pretty rich coming from a regime that has, such a long history of manipulating elections.
Right. And I think this really underscores the point that nothing has changed for Russia. They still want to get rid of the government in Kyiv.
Exactly.
And they still want to install a puppet regime.
Right. So all this talk about peace and elections is really just a tactical maneuver to try to achieve that same goal.
Right. And I think the article also makes this really good point about how the Kremlin doesn't see democratic processes as, something to be respected.
Yeah.
Right. They see them as a battlefield.
Exactly. Yeah. They see it as an opportunity to advance their own interests.
Right. And, I mean, we've seen this, right? They've interfered in elections in Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, they've even, tried to influence referendums like in Moldova.
Right.
When they were voting on EU candidacy.
Yeah.
And of course, we just talked about Georgia.
Right.
And the whole idea is to basically, delegitimize these elections
Hmm.
to make people think that they're not free and fair.
Right. And to frame it all as Western propaganda,
Right.
trying to undermine these sovereign nations.
Right, right. And I think the Marine Le Pen example is perfect for this.
Yeah.
When she was convicted of embezzlement,
Right.
um, the pro-Kremlin media immediately jumped on that and said, oh, this is proof that the EU is a dictatorship
Right.
and that they're interfering in elections.
Yeah, despite their own very extensive record of doing the same thing.
Right, right. But then, contrast that with how silent they are about the elections in Belarus,
Exactly.
where Lukashenko just, stays in power.
Yeah, and political prisoners are, being persecuted.
Right, right. So clearly, the Kremlin is not actually concerned with democracy.
Right. They only care about it when it's convenient for them.
Right. And then, we have to remember that Russia has a history of using fake elections to justify taking territory and to control things. I mean, we saw this in the occupied territories in Ukraine.
Exactly. The referendums that they held there were completely sham elections.
Right.
And then, of course, Putin's own elections are very carefully managed.
Right, right. So, I mean, it's clear that for the Kremlin, elections are a tool to be used, not a process to be respected.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's about control, not about democracy.
Right, right. So looking at everything that we've talked about, I mean, what's the takeaway here?
Well, I think the takeaway is that the Kremlin is very consistently trying to undermine democracy and so discord.
Right.
In Georgia, they're trying to destabilize the country and push it away from the West.
Right.
And in Ukraine, they're using this talk of elections as a way to advance their own agenda.
Right. And they're doing all of this by spreading disinformation and manipulating people.
Exactly. Yeah. They're trying to erode public trust in institutions, discredit the opposition, portray the West as an enemy.
Right, right. So basically it's the same old playbook.
Yeah, pretty much. But the methods are constantly evolving.
Right. And that's what makes it so dangerous, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's something that we need to be very aware of.
So given all of that, what should people be watching out for in the future? I mean, if this is the pattern that we're seeing, what's next?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, if we look at what they've done in Georgia, what they're doing in Ukraine, you have to wonder what other democratic processes, what other regions might be next on their list. And I think the key is to be vigilant, to pay attention to those subtle indicators, those early signs of disinformation campaigns taking root. Because the sooner we can identify them, the better equipped we'll be to counter them.
Right. Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap up for today. Thanks to everyone for listening.
Yeah, thank you.
And we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.